Hello, couples, and welcome back again to Thrive, where we give you practical tools to build a stronger marriage together.
And as we've said before, Thrive is focused on building stronger marriages together. So let me ask you something as we start this session. Have you ever heard of one of these phrases? The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. He's a chip off the old block. Like father, like son. She's just like her mother.
Hey. Okay, thank you. Easy now with the last one. Now listen, these may just be cliches, but sayings become cliches for a reason.
Yeah.
And the reason is that there is a measure of truth behind them. The fact of the matter is, we inherit much from our parents and the environments in which we were raised.
Whether we realize it or not, we all tend to either embrace or rebel against our parents' way of doing things. And sometimes we even relate to our spouses by reverting back to the ways we related to our parents, or in some cases, the way we watched our parents relate to one another.
Consider for just a moment the number of things influenced by the homes we were raised in. How we handle money, how we celebrate holidays,
How we handle conflict, how we show affection,
and how we tidy our home. And the list could just go on and on and on.
Maybe your family freely expressed emotions and your spouse's family didn't. Maybe your parents argued loudly and often while your spouse's parents never fought in front of the kids. We often assume that our family style of communication and resolving conflict were normal. But normal to you may be completely foreign to your spouse.
Yeah, and this can really result in a clash of styles or confusion about your spouse's behavior and exactly how to respond to it. And on top of that, if your spouse behaves in a way that even subconsciously reminds you of something hurtful a parent did, you may find yourself reacting exactly the way you did as a kid, rebelling, retreating, or even lashing out.
How many times have you and your spouse argued over something silly? Like which end of the toothpaste tube you're supposed to squeeze?
Okay.
You may have even realized in the middle of one of these silly arguments that the issue you were arguing about wasn't the real issue at all. Because there's usually something larger beneath the surface that's driving the conflict. And in some instances, we're not even aware of how our past is informing our present relationship with our spouse.
I imagine at this point, you're sitting at home, nodding your head, because you may have seen this at play in your relationship. Now that we all see how our past can impact our relationships with our spouses, the next step is to determine what we do about it. So let's listen in as Russ and Danielle share how they've learned to chart a different way forward together. And then we'll be back to wrap up at the end.
One of the first things our counselor did when we met was to draw out our family tree. It was incredible to see the patterns he noticed repeated almost every generation in our families. It was important for us to understand the patterns to intentionally undo harmful behaviors and double down on the good behaviors. We all tend to either embrace or rebel against our parents' way of doing things. Sometimes we even relate to our spouses by reverting back to the ways we related to our parents. One thing I have done is to make the intentional step to avoid shutting down during conflict in family relationships.
And in my family, I had to make the intentional step to stop the generational pain of alcoholism and drug addiction that plagued our family. By not drinking alcohol and then working on the resulting trauma inflicted by addiction to minimize the impact on our family going forward. So we agreed to counseling because we knew the odds were not in our favor. Both our parents' marriages did not work out. My first marriage ended in divorce after 12 years, and Danielle was 38 and never been married, and for a reason. And have you seen the divorce stats for second marriages?
When we share that we've continued going to counseling almost once a month since our engaged days, we get the major eye rolls. Like, why? What's wrong with you two? And I used to care about the eye rolls until what I was learning was creating such peace and harmony inside of our marriage. Growing up, when my parents fought, my mom would end up going to her bedroom and cry. It used to stress me out terribly as a child, and I vowed never to mimic that kind of behavior. Do you know what our counselor today calls me? A turtle. Why? Because I shut down and go to my room and cry. As much as our parents' behavior may have turned us off, we subconsciously have a way of reverting back to their behavior.
Yeah, you can grow up in well-adjusted, loving families and still experience conflict with your spouse because your normals are different from each other. The households we grew up in defined our sense of normal. A perfect example for us was when it came to disciplining the children. Naturally, in a blended family, it is even more complicated, but for simplicity's sake, I'll share this one difference. I grew up in a chaotic environment, and Danielle grew up in what she calls a mom who was like Martha Stewart's on steroids. The discipline was strict.
Yeah.
And when it came to discipline in our home, Danielle was on one end of the extreme, expecting strict consequences for bad behavior.
Sorry, kids.
While I was on the other end, I would get mad initially, but I would rarely carry through with my threats. So this caused a lot of conflict between us. But counseling pointed out these family differences, and it helped us to be more mindful of compromising. Neither of us was right, and as obvious as this might have been to us, we couldn't see it. And we're so grateful for our counselor's insight. And one of the most powerful epiphanies, in our personal opinion, is the core reason for our conflict. It's not necessarily about children or money or household duties, but it's the fact that we bump into each other's emotional wounds, which are often from our childhood.
And here's an example. Meet Mr. and Mrs. Mugg. Mr. and Mrs. Mugg met right after college, and like many people, when they saw each other, he was like, whoa, and she was like, woo. He had a degree and a future, and she was, well, look at her, she's a knockout. When they first started dating and hanging out, they were so careful because he's trying to win her heart and she's trying to win his affection. They had a few little problems along the way, a couple of bumps in the relationship, but they were just so careful. And then they got married. About a month into their marriage, they had a problem. They had a bump and stuff came out. And he looked at her and said, whoa, where did all that come from? And she looked at him and said, I didn't know you had anger issues. And he said, well, I didn't have anger issues until you bumped me. And then they had another problem and another. So she went to see her sister and said, I didn't know he was like that. And he sat around thinking, wow, she makes me so mad. And if she would just quit bumping me like that, maybe I wouldn't be so mad. My wife, she has issues. And so he says to her, you know, when we were dating, I didn't see all this. Where's this coming from? She says, well, every time we get in an argument, you make me act that way. Now, here's what I want you to see. Mr. Mugg thinks the reason the blue beads come out of him is because they keep having conflict, and she keeps bumping him. Mrs. Mugg thinks the reason the pink beads keep coming out of her is because they are having a problem and he keeps bumping her. Here's the truth. The reason the blue beads come out of Mr. Mugg is because that's what's in there. And the reason the pink beads come out of Mrs. Mugg is because that's what's in there. Inside these mugs are past experiences, hurts, pictures we've seen of marriage, and much of that is shaped by the families in which we were raised. When our mugs are full, it doesn't take much for us to overreact. And when we overreact, what's inside our mug comes pouring out. This is the best visual of counseling. You think it's your spouse's fault for making you angry, but in reality, it's learning and addressing what's inside of you. Confession. When someone hurts my feelings, I truly thought it was all about them. And after years of counseling, I'm now able to take responsibility and identify why my strong reactions are more about me than the actual circumstance. So here's an example. Russ and I can go to a party with some of his friends, and it's easy for them to reminisce about their football days for hours. I can leave the party and be hurt over being ignored. It used to always be Russ's fault for me feeling ignored. But the work I've done on myself now, over the years in counseling, is learning to connect the dots of being ignored when I was younger. It is truly my deepest emotional wound, and it doesn't take much to bump up against it. So you can imagine how difficult our arguments were because Russ would honestly not be ignoring me at the party, and I would be upset at him for not taking responsibility. So doing my work has released him of this internal battle I have.
And doing the work is difficult, but it has paid us dividends in peace and harmony. And better yet, the closeness we have in our marriage.
Now, before a party with his friends, I can give Russ a gentle reminder, which requires me to be vulnerable and share this wound of mine. If our spouse behaves in a way that even subconsciously reminds us of something hurtful our parents did, we may find ourselves reacting exactly the way we did as a kid, rebelling, retreating, or lashing out.
Because my father was a very violent alcoholic and drug addict, I tend to magnify situations and overreact. And I usually do it with a disgusted and intense tone. I often have a 10 response to a 2 circumstance. Now you can imagine how hard this is on our marriage. Danielle, with our counselor's help, has worked with me to manage this challenge for my family of origin. And as I have learned why this happens and then learned tools like the Why Am I So Angry exercise, my overreactions are less often and less intense. And when I do overreact, Danielle is so compassionate, as she has learned it is much more about me and not her. While everyone has some negative traits from their family of origin that impacts their marriages, we also have positive traits that impact our marriages. For example, my mother's faith, her unconditional love, her encouragement, and her work ethic while I was growing up has had a very positive impact on our marriage.
And likewise, my parents' faith, providing for us even when times were tough, and being constant encouragers, that has brought a lot of positive traits into our marriage as well. And speaking of faith, God actually has instructions to us about our families of origin and our marriage. Listen to what is recorded in Genesis 2:24. That is why a man leaves his father and his mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. Maybe this verse was read at your wedding, and it definitely speaks to the fact that each spouse leaves their family of origin to become a new family when they're married. But there's much more conveyed in this short verse. The picture God paints of marriage can be described as oneness. The man and woman become one flesh. Now, when you think of your bodies, your flesh, there's one thing we've all experienced. If you hurt your toe, your entire body is focused on caring for the pain you're experiencing in your toe. That's how our physical bodies are designed to work. When one part suffers, the other parts respond. God says that in marriage, a new oneness is created. When you think of this picture God describes of you and your spouse as one, what happens if one of you has a hurt or a wound? The other one responds and cares for the other. So when reactions or overreactions occur in our relationships, that can be a warning sign to us that there is hurt.
Now, when we better understand our tendencies based on our past hurts or wounds, and when we can explain them to our spouse, and when we can invite our spouse into the healing process, our marriage will thrive like never before. It's like having scar tissue removed. The surgery is so messy and the recovery is painful, but our quality of life improves radically and quickly. Now, ignoring past hurts doesn't make them go away. If we bury them for too long, then we tend to grow numb and we limit our capacity to love and be loved. But here's the good news, is that when you know better, you can do better. The fact that you are tuned in and doing these exercises together shows that you're on your way to a stronger marriage. And remember, marriage was God's idea in the first place. He designed it, and He is with you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
I know that each of you want a thriving marriage. It's evident that you do because you're making the time to complete these sessions together. Taking a good, and at times, hard look at how we've been impacted by our families of origin is a big part of building and growing a thriving marriage.
That's right. So we want you to take a good look at the relationships in your families through an exercise on your relational needs again, but this time based on your family of origin.
Yeah, and we've also provided questions to help you unpack what you've learned from the relational needs chart. You may learn something new about your or your spouse's family that you never knew. And it may motivate you to want to meet the needs of your spouse that their parents did not meet as well. We believe in you. We're cheering you on.
That's right.
And we'll see you at the next session.